The second main model used in international trade is the two-factor analysis. Instead of just focusing on labor as the only input, we now focus on a second factor of production. In this case, we're going to call it capital. If you just had two equations, the first constraint we're going to say is our labor constraint. And when you sketch that, the slope is given right here. And you also sketch the capital constraint. And if you do that, the slope is given right here. So at this particular point right here, we'd say that the economy is at full employment. If you were on this lower line segment, which represents the labor constraint, you would say that you're using all of the labor you have, but there's still some capital left over. So this area right here would represent unemployed capital, and this area here would represent unemployed labor. A developing country, very important point, is more likely to be producing on this frontier, or this line segment, using all of the capital it has, and having a surplus of labor. That's Lewis's original idea, and the Harrod-Domar model as well, that many of these countries had a surplus of labor, and if they could get more capital, they would produce more goods. Let me show you very quickly the effect of increasing the amount of capital. Remember, in the equation, so if I were to increase the intercept from right here, I'm shifting the capital constraint outward, you can see that the economy would increase its production possibilities by the area right here. That would be a larger production possibilities set. Notice what happens at the intersection. This is very important. At the intersection, you would see that the intersection would occur somewhere here, and if it does, it would mean that rather than producing this quantity of X, we're now going to produce a lower quantity of X. Rather than producing this quantity of Y on the vertical axis, we're producing a larger quantity of Y. Again, notice that when we have more capital in this economy, we would have more of good Y being produced and less of good X being produced. If you were to think this through, the logic would be that if you get more capital, and one of the industries uses a higher amount of capital compared to labor than the second industry, the additional capital will go into that capital-intensive industry. We would call our two industries capital-intensive and labor-intensive. And if we get more capital, it would draw labor out of the labor-intensive industry, and that labor will combine with the capital to go into the capital-intensive industry. It's a very important depiction there. I hope you get the main point. Recall when I introduced the Ricardian model, I took the labor demand and divided the quantities of labor by the quantities of output and created input-output ratios. I'm going to do the same thing at this point. If you look at the first equation, you see that's exactly what we had for the Ricardian model. I'm adding a second resource, capital, doing a similar analysis, multiplying and dividing by X, multiplying and dividing by Y, and creating input-output ratios. Now I have 4 of these, ALX, ALY, the original 2, AKX, AKY, going with the capital constraint. The logic of what I said earlier can be figured out that if you have more labor, you would produce more of the labor-intensive good. If you get more capital, you will produce more of the capital-intensive good. The logic does not stop there. There's a trade-off, because as you draw labor out of the labor-intensive sector, the output of the labor-intensive sector should contract. So when we bring more capital into the system, it will draw labor out of the labor-intensive industry, causing the first sector to expand. There's one thing I would like to say here, because most textbooks do not use the linear programming version of the production possibilities frontier. What they do is they use a smooth PPF. The key point I want to make here is that often countries are operating in the short run, and I think the linear programming version of the analysis is much more acute in solving the problems and thinking through the problems when there's short-run decision making than is the smooth PPF version, which is for the long run. The key point I want to make here is that because there's a unique full employment point when the straight line segment PPF touches the smooth PPF, If there were some way that we could mop up the excess, in this particular case, here is my labor constraint. So here we have underemployed capital. If I can somehow combine that underemployed capital or unemployed capital with the labor, I can squeeze out some more productivity, and you understand this segment of the production possibilities frontier. In a similar vein, if this is my capital constraint and I have unemployed labor, if I can force that labor to come back to work with the capital in some different way, then I should be able to get more output. I reiterate and remind you that the version of the PPF you see in textbooks is that smooth PPF version. I wish more textbooks would use the linear programming version because it conveys the idea, firstly, that there's unemployment or underemployment of resources. The next bit of analysis looks rather complex, and I hate the idea of showing you a final version of a problem. I prefer that you see how it is worked out. But this is called the Edgeworth Box. In this Edgeworth Box analysis, I'd like to show you the original production possibilities set for country A. I want to tell you there's a second country, country B, which has same input-output ratios, and it has its own production possibilities set and frontier. What Edgeworth wanted to do was to take one of the countries' production possibilities set, rotate it 180 degrees, push the two of them together to create what he calls a production point, and then say that the countries can trade their way back to the levels of consumption that they would desire. Notice that when there is no trade, you have to produce and consume the same thing, and I'm saying here that country B would have preferred and consumed point BC. Country A would have preferred and consumed point AC. And now because they're both in the same quadrant, I call this the northwest quadrant of the analysis, you can do further analyses on these two to show that there would be gains from trade. In other words, if you recognize that each point in the analysis represents a level of good X and a level of good Y, then you could see that a point such as this one right here contains more of good X. There will be an increase in good Y. And we're saying at the ultimate end of this analysis that when two countries that are minding their own business, so to speak, recognize the mutual interdependence, they will change their production patterns, produce at full employment, and then trade their way back to the intersection of these two indifference curves, higher level indifference curves. And that would show that country B that started out consuming at this level right here can now consume more. Country A, which started consuming at this level, can now consume more. And that tells us that there are gains from trade. The gains from trade require that the countries move away from their autarky, production equals consumption points, specialize partially at full employment, and then trade their way back to the consumption levels. And that says that trade is good. That is where the Hecksher-Ohlin or the two-factor model leads us. The analysis we just undertook pointed to the fact that both countries would be better off at IC1 indifference curve 1 for both countries because it would represent more of both goods than they had in autarky. This is a very good deal, and therefore we say that two countries would have a basis for trade when they consume in different patterns, or when their resources, the ratio of their resources is very different from what they currently have. The country with a large amount of capital per worker is said to be capital abundant. The country with a large amount of labor per unit of capital is called labor abundant. A relatively capital rich country will export capital intensive goods. In this analysis, the way we would show exports is by saying the countries are going to move their production from point AC to point PT, say, sell exports, purchase imports, and in the process move from AC to AC1. You can see then that AC1 contains more of good X and more of good Y than does AC. So that would say that there are gains to be had from international trade for both countries. This analysis suggests that trade will occur and benefit both countries A and B if they like different bundles of goods X and Y. if A likes the point AC and B likes the point BC. Pre-trade, both can benefit from trade. In an international trade class, the comment I like to alert students to very early is that differences are what drive trade. In the Ricardian model, it is differences in relative factor abilities, and in the Hecksher-Ohlin model, it is relative factor abundances. So one country has a higher capital per worker ratio than the second country, and the country with the higher capital labor ratio would export capital intensive goods. The country with the additional or larger amount of labor will produce and export labor intensive goods. We've spent some time developing the Hecksher-Ohlin idea, and you can see that both countries would benefit if they're producing at points A, C, and BC in autarky. This is the smooth PPF version of the model. The analysis will continue to be the same. Here's the relative price line after trade. The relative price line, or the ratio of prices before trade, is given by the intersection of the indifference curve and the production possibilities frontier in both cases. And even if these countries never declared what their original prices were, we can assume a barter type economy, which means that trade will occur. The key point here is that when you discover the second country with a difference in relative abilities, you pretty much offer to do for them the things they can't do for themselves, and vice versa, receiving from them the things you don't like or you can't do for yourself. And clearly then both countries should be better off at a point such as the red dot, because it contains more of good X and slightly more of good Y for both countries. How much trade will occur? Well, in the case where the two countries have different relative factor abundances or like different things, you can see that the indifference curves would be in the same quadrant. Sometimes I label the quadrants northwest, southeast, and southwest. So this is the southeast quadrant, and the quadrant at the top is the northwest quadrant. In the southeast quadrant, there's a point such as right here. I don't have a label for it, and that would say that one country would produce at this point, consume at this point, so it'll be exporting that particular good, and the second country would be importing quantities that the first country made available. This is called the trade triangle, and it measures the balance between exports and imports. If you were to zoom in on the trade triangles, this would represent maybe exports. I call this exports, exports, imports, imports. But each country would have an identical trade triangle, and it's given up one thing to acquire more of the second thing.